Picture this. You're standing in the gardens of a royal palace, where roses once bloomed under balconies lined with silk and gold. You hear soft music drifting on the wind, the laughter of courtiers, the shuffle of embroidered slippers across polished marble. But behind the splendor, behind the perfumes and power, lies a darker ritual, one hidden in shadowed courtyards and whispered about only after nightfall. Now listen closely. You can almost hear it, the rusted creak of chains, the hiss of fire, the shallow breaths of a man too terrified to scream. His crime? Offending a king. His sentence? Death, not quick, not clean, but crafted as a performance, a lesson, and a legacy. In the world of royal justice, executions weren't merely punishments. They were public theater, choreographed, brutal, unforgettable. Because a monarch didn't just kill. A monarch made you watch. This is the tragic story of pain and power. In royal courts, justice was never just about right and wrong. It was about control, about fear, about making sure that every trembling servant, every scheming noble, every watching eye knew exactly what would happen if they stepped out of line. In kingdoms where power was inherited, not earned, the only way to keep it was through spectacle. And no spectacle sent a clearer message than the death of a traitor. Not behind closed doors, not with mercy, but dragged into the public square, stripped of name, rank, and dignity, and slowly taken apart for all to see. Take the case of Edward II's lover, Hugh Despenser, in 1326. His crime? Loving a king too openly and gaining too much power. When Queen Isabella and her rebel army captured him, they didn't simply execute him. They made an example. Hugh was stripped, tied to a ladder in front of a howling crowd, and forced to watch as his genitals were cut off and burned before his eyes. Then his stomach was sliced open, his entrails pulled out while he still breathed, his heart torn from his chest. Only then was his head removed. This wasn't justice. This was a message, written in blood, carved into public memory. No man, no matter how favored, was untouchable. But if Despenser's fate was grotesque, it was at least swift compared to Lin Kai, or death by 1,000 cuts. Imported to the royal courts of China during the Ming dynasty, it was reserved for traitors and regicides. The condemned was tied to a wooden frame. Then, slowly, methodically, over the course of hours or even days, pieces of the body were sliced away, flesh from the arms, the thighs, the cheeks. The executioner was trained not just to kill, but to prolong, to calculate exactly how many cuts the human body could endure before mercy came. The worst part? The victim often received an opium dose beforehand, not to numb the pain, but to keep them conscious long enough to feel every last blade. Their crime forgotten, their suffering eternal. In medieval England, a woman's body wasn't spared horror either. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was 67 years old when King Henry VIII ordered her execution. She had committed no act of treason, only borne the wrong bloodline. Taken to the scaffold in 1541, she refused to kneel, claiming she was no traitor. The inexperienced executioner struck her shoulder instead of her neck. She screamed. He struck again, missing. Again. Again. It took 11 blows to end her life. The crowd was silent. This was not just a death, it was humiliation. The desecration of an elderly woman, once a respected noble, now butchered like cattle on the king's orders. The execution was not simply about eliminating a threat. It was about desecrating lineage, turning a Plantagenet into an object of pity and fear. In France, the breaking wheel was reserved for the most despised criminals. A man would be tied to a cartwheel, limbs stretched out. The executioner, holding a heavy iron bar, would then smash the bones in a specific order. Legs, arms, then spine, carefully, deliberately avoiding the heart. The goal was not to kill, but to ruin. To leave the man broken, bleeding, and alive, his limbs twisted like a grotesque flower. Sometimes they'd place him on display, tied to the wheel on a post, left to die over several days as birds picked at his wounds. In the royal square, beneath the towers of power, peasants would pass by, children would gawk, priests would pray, and the king would be remembered, not as a man of mercy, but of dominion. Royal executions weren't only physical punishments, they were psychological warfare, designed to stain memory, to echo in dreams. In Persia, some criminals were sewn into freshly flayed animal skins and left in the sun. As the skin dried, it would contract, squeezing the victim until bones broke and blood vessels burst. In another case, the condemned was placed inside a hollowed bronze bowl. A fire was lit beneath it, and as the metal grew hot, the man inside screamed in agony. But the bowl had been designed with acoustics. His cries would echo out through the nostrils, transformed into the sound of an animal's bellow. To the watching court, it was a performance. A man burned alive, his screams turned into theater. But perhaps the most perverse executions weren't even about crime. They were about spectacle. In ancient Rome, the Emperor Nero was known for cruelty disguised as performance. During nighttime garden parties, he'd tie Christians to posts, douse them in oil, and set them on fire to light the festivities. Guests drank and laughed beneath burning bodies. This wasn't justice. It wasn't punishment. It was entertainment. And it sent a clear message: power belongs to those who hold the torch, not those who scream beneath it. Execution methods varied across centuries and kingdoms, but one thing remained constant. They reflected the fears of those in power. A ruler who feared betrayal would invent a punishment worse than death. A king insecure in his throne would silence dissent not with reason, but with horror. These weren't simply crimes against the body. They were assaults on the soul, on legacy, on identity. In royal history, to die was not enough. One had to die badly, die painfully, die publicly, because only then would the lesson be learned. Only then would the crown feel safe. And yet, as we walk today through the gilded corridors of palaces, as we marvel at crowns encased in glass and thrones placed on velvet, we forget the blood that cemented their authority. We forget the screams buried beneath marble floors, the bones hidden beneath the stones of royal plazas. The execution was the price of order, and often, it was paid by those whose only crime was being on the wrong side of a whisper. If the first lesson of royal execution was spectacle, the second was patience, because slow death was the purest expression of absolute control. A quick death was a mercy, and mercy was weakness. Monarchs didn't just demand obedience, they demanded time. Time to peel back the humanity of their enemies inch by inch. And nowhere was this more chillingly practiced than in the Persian Empire's most feared method, scaphism, or the boats. It sounds absurd, death by milk and honey, but the process was an act of engineered madness. The condemned was stripped naked and bound between two hollowed-out canoes or logs, leaving only their head, hands, and feet exposed. Then came the feeding, buckets of honey, milk, and rich, fermenting food forced into their system while the same was smeared on their body. It wasn't just to humiliate. It was bait. Flies, worms, beetles, every insect imaginable came for the feast. Over days, sometimes weeks, their skin would rot as maggots laid eggs in open sores. The body swelled, fermented from within, while the victim remained alive and conscious, consumed piece by things too small to see. It was a horror so detailed, so intimate in its cruelty, that it became legend. And legends, kings knew, lasted longer than bodies. Across the continent in medieval France, psychological horror took on a more theatrical form with breaking on the wheel. A cartwheel, something mundane, everyday, became a stage for dismemberment. The victim was tied down and bludgeoned with iron bars, their limbs shattered at calculated points. Not to kill, but to deform. Then the twisted body was woven between the spokes of the wheel, raised high for the townspeople to see. An exhibit of state power spun into grotesque still life. Some were kept alive, hung on display for days as birds picked at them. Their final breath was not private. It was communal, a memory shared by a village, a warning etched into generations. But perhaps no royal method combined humiliation, sexual shame, and slow death quite like impalement, famously employed by Vlad the Impaler, the real-life inspiration for Dracula. This wasn't just about killing. It was about violating. A long, sharpened stake was greased and inserted, rectally or vaginally, sometimes with the victim fully conscious and screaming, other times drugged and limp. The stake was then raised vertically and slowly allowed to descend under gravity, piercing organs inch by inch, sometimes taking hours or even days before exiting the mouth or shoulder. The impaled were displayed outside city gates, fields of human flags that waved in the wind. The message was clear: the prince controls your body even in death. In royal courts, cruelty wasn't always about barbarism. Sometimes it masqueraded as civility, clothed in procedure and elegance. The Iron Mask of 17th century France is a prime example. Not a method of execution in the traditional sense, but a living death. The masked prisoner, held in secrecy, was stripped of identity, voice, and history. The mask itself was likely made of velvet-lined iron, not to cause pain, but to erase. No name, no trial, no grave. Just a figure walking through the corridors of a fortress, faceless and forgotten. Rumored to be a twin of King Louis XIV, or a noble with dangerous secrets, he became a symbol of what happened to those who knew too much. In monarchies, silence could be deadlier than swords. Further east, in the Indian subcontinent, the Mughal Empire brought elegance and artistry even to execution. One method used was trampling by elephant, a punishment reserved for nobility or military traitors. But it wasn't always swift. The elephant could be trained to crush limbs first, stepping gently, breaking ribs or legs one at a time, before finally pressing its enormous weight onto the skull. Crowds gathered to watch, not just because it was rare, but because it was poetic. A king's beast, obeying commands like clockwork, ending a human life with ritual precision. Power flowed from man to animal, from emperor to earth. Then there was flaying, the peeling away of skin while a person still breathed. Not all kingdoms favored it, but in places like Assyria and later, under certain Chinese dynasties, it was used as a tool of ultimate degradation. The skin was removed slowly, starting with the face or back. Sometimes the victim was drugged to keep them from passing out too soon. The goal wasn't just to kill, it was to unmake. To take the recognizable human and reduce them to meat, publicly, in the heart of the capital, where artisans and poets once thrived. In those moments, the monarch didn't merely end a life. They erased the idea of rebellion. These methods weren't random. They were curated, like a gallery of nightmares designed by rulers who understood that fear was currency, and executions were their most reliable form of propaganda. Behind each act of brutality stood a monarch who believed that power must not only be held, it must be seen. And what better way to show it than by turning death itself into art? And as the centuries passed, the methods evolved, but the principle remained. Royalty may have changed their garments, languages, and religions, but the thirst for dominance, for unforgettable violence, never quite vanished. It just put on a different mask. As we move forward, we'll witness the final executions on our list, some even more horrifying because of their psychological torment, others because they were committed in the name of virtue, purity, or divine right. What happens when death isn't the worst part? When it's the weight, the performance, or the betrayal that lingers longer than blood? The next methods will take us from suffocating prisons to burning altars, from the illusion of mercy to the reality of monsters wearing crowns. And they will reveal a darker truth, that in royal history, execution wasn't just about who died, it was about who watched. Royal executions often blurred the lines between punishment and ritual, cruelty and ceremony, as power was wielded not only with a sword but with spectacle. The final acts of many condemned souls became legendary. And in these closing examples, the horror becomes not just physical, but psychological. a torment meant to haunt for lifetimes. One of the most chilling methods was the breaking wheel's darker cousin, the gibbet or hanging in chains. While public hangings were common across Europe, the gibbet took cruelty further. The condemned was hanged until near death. Then their body was left to dangle in iron cages or chains high above town squares. The slow decay of flesh, the exposure to birds and weather, turned the person into a grotesque monument of shame. Their families lived in infamy. The sight itself became a grim warning etched into collective memory. Some gibbets remained for years, skeletal remains swaying with the wind, an unending spectacle of royal justice. This wasn't just death. It was a curse. In Japan's feudal era, a method called seppuku or ritual suicide carried its own cruel dignity. Samurai were expected to end their own lives by disembowelment, wielding a short sword to pierce their abdomen in a deliberate, agonizing act. This was not merely execution. It was a performance of honor and shame intertwined. A condemned samurai would prepare meticulously, writing farewell poems, dressing in white, and choosing witnesses, often friends or enemies who would then perform the mercy stroke to end the agony. But for the condemned, this slow death was a final assertion of control, an attempt to reclaim power from a fate imposed by others. To die not as a victim, but as a warrior. Across the Mediterranean, the Roman crucifixion was the state's most brutal spectacle. Though it was largely reserved for slaves and rebels, a few royal traitors met this horrific fate. Nailed or tied to wooden crosses, victims were left to die from exposure, dehydration, and asphyxiation over hours or days. The position itself, arms outstretched, chest collapsing, made breathing increasingly painful until the victim suffocated. What made crucifixion terrifying wasn't just the physical torture. It was the utter helplessness and the public display of defeat. Emperors used it as a stark reminder. No one, not even the lowliest, could escape imperial wrath. Meanwhile, in the heart of medieval Europe, another execution combined the promise of mercy with unfathomable cruelty. The guillotine, a machine of swift justice, would one day become synonymous with the French Revolution, but its origins are rooted in royal courts. Introduced as a humane alternative to slower tortures, it was meant to spare victims prolonged suffering. Yet the guillotine's very precision became a chilling symbol of the indiscriminate power of the state. The falling blade did not discriminate. Kings, queens, peasants alike met their fate beneath its shadow. To die beneath the guillotine was to become a cog in the relentless machine of revolution and retribution. It wasn't just death, it was the erasure of identity. The theme of slow death took a particularly cruel form in the starvation and imprisonment of royal prisoners. Sometimes, rulers would spare their enemies physical violence but sentence them to years, sometimes decades, of confinement in small, dark rooms. Cut off from light, human contact, and hope, prisoners withered away. Consider the fate of the imprisoned Queen Elizabeth of France, locked away in the Château d'If for years. Or the infamous imprisonment of the French Dauphin, the son of King Louis XVI, whose death in captivity remains shrouded in suspicion and tragedy. Such imprisonments were death sentences without ceremony. The body might remain intact, but the mind was slowly crushed, the soul starved. There is perhaps no darker story than that of Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, whose execution combined political treachery with personal tragedy. Accused of adultery, incest, and treason, her trial was a sham, a performance staged to end her life and secure the throne for her husband, Henry VIII's new bride. On May 19, 1536, Anne was led to the scaffold with dignity, aware of the eyes upon her. Unlike the usual acts, she was granted the mercy of a skilled French executioner who delivered a single, clean stroke. But the years of political machinations, betrayals, and isolation preceding her death marked a slow emotional execution. Her downfall was a reminder of how royal power could be wielded as a weapon, destroying not only bodies but reputations, histories, and legacies. In the Ottoman Empire, the execution of princes was carried out in silence and secrecy, by strangulation with a silk cord. This method, called garrote, was merciful in appearance but merciless in purpose. No blood spilled, no public spectacle made, only quiet removal of threats to the throne. Princes who could one day challenge the Sultan's rule were eliminated swiftly but quietly to avoid civil war. The silence of their deaths contrasts starkly with the public horrors elsewhere, yet the fear it instilled was no less powerful. The invisible knife of political survival was as sharp as any sword. Even in the modern era, echoes of royal executions reverberate. The last royal execution by firing squad in Europe was that of King Charles I of England in 1649, an event that shook the very foundation of monarchy. Stripped of his title, tried publicly for treason against his own people, Charles was beheaded. His calm acceptance of death turned the execution into a symbol of the fallibility of kings and the rise of parliamentary power. Yet the execution was a violent rupture in history, a royal bloodline severed by the hand of its own subjects, proving that no crown was untouchable. When we look back on these 10 brutal executions, a pattern emerges. It's not simply the physical pain inflicted that defines them, but the psychological weight of humiliation, the performance of power, and the lasting scars left on nations and families. These executions were not just ends to lives. They were beginnings to legends, warnings to subjects, and messages to rivals. The women and men who died these deaths were not merely criminals or traitors. They were symbols of what happens when power is challenged, when lineage is questioned, and when the fragile balance of royal authority is threatened. Their suffering was not just punishment but a spectacle meant to preserve the myth of invincibility. And yet, beneath the layers of history's bloodstains, we glimpse the truth. These methods reveal the deepest fears of those who ruled. The fear that their throne could crumble. The fear that their legacy might be forgotten. The fear that beneath the crown, they were no different from those they condemned. Today, as we walk through royal palaces, study gilded portraits, or marvel at crowns enshrined behind glass, it is worth remembering the cost, both human and moral, on which these symbols stand. Behind every jewel and embroidered robe, there are stories of pain, betrayal, and death. Stories that history books sometimes gloss over, but which shaped the world we live in. If these stories of unimaginable cruelty, power, and survival moved you, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden truths. Share your thoughts in the comments. What execution shocked you the most? And where should we journey next in the dark corridors of royal history? Because history is not just about kings and queens, battles and treaties. It's about the people who lived, suffered, and died under their shadow. And their stories deserve to be told. If these dark tales of power and punishment fascinated you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from royal history. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which execution method shocked you the most? And what historical mystery do you want us to explore next? Your curiosity keeps these stories alive. Join the conversation and help us uncover the secrets buried beneath the crowns. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is never as clean as the textbooks say.